Look at any major city built before 1900, and the official explanation is straightforward. Growing populations created demand. Demand attracted investment. Investment produced infrastructure. It's a clean, logical sequence that most historians agree on. But here's where the numbers start to feel strange. In 1850, the city of St. Louis had a population of roughly 77,000 people. That same decade, engineers broke ground on a waterworks system designed to serve over 500,000. Not eventually. At the time of construction. The system wasn't scaled for growth over a century. It was built, almost immediately, at a capacity that the city wouldn't reach for another 60 years. That's not planning ahead. That's building for a city that didn't exist yet. And St. Louis wasn't alone. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Let's start with what we know. The mid to late 19th century is widely described as an era of explosive industrial ambition. Steam power had matured. Iron production was scaling. Political will, in Europe, in the Americas, across Russia, was increasingly channeled into what historians call civic infrastructure. Roads, rail, sewage, water, public buildings. The accepted narrative is that industrializing economies needed these systems to function, and so they built them. That explanation is not wrong. But it becomes harder to hold comfortably when you examine not what was built, but when, at what scale, and with what apparent readiness. Consider the European rail network. Britain's rail expansion between 1840 and 1870 is one of the most documented infrastructure stories in history. Thousands of miles of track laid in under 3 decades. But buried within that story is a detail that rarely gets examined in isolation: the tunnels. Across Britain, France, and the German states, railway tunnels from this period were bored with a precision and a load-bearing capacity that, in several documented cases, exceeded any train technology available at the time of construction. Engineers built tunnels rated for loads that the locomotives of that era couldn't produce. One interpretation is that engineers were optimistic, that they anticipated heavier engines. Another interpretation is simply that they had a template. That something about how these systems were designed carried assumptions beyond what contemporary technology required. Neither interpretation is a conclusion, but the pattern is worth sitting with. Now move east, to Russia. The Trans-Siberian Railway is typically cited as one of the great engineering achievements of the late 19th century, begun in 1891, stretching over 9,000 kilometers across some of the harshest terrain on the planet. The standard explanation: Tsarist Russia needed to connect its vast eastern territories for military and economic purposes. That explanation holds, until you look at the supporting infrastructure. Along the Trans-Siberian route, station buildings were constructed, not as functional transit points, but as architectural structures of considerable scale and ornamentation. Small towns with populations in the low hundreds received stations built with stone foundations, vaulted ceilings, and facade detailing that, in Western Europe, would have been reserved for major urban terminals. The economic logic of that investment, relative to the populations those stations actually served, has been noted by architectural historians as unusual. Unusual doesn't mean unexplained. But it does mean the explanation, "we built what we needed," becomes harder to apply without adjustment. Because these weren't isolated decisions. Across Siberia, across the Ural corridor, across Central Asian territories, the pattern held: infrastructure built to a standard that the immediate population and economy couldn't justify, but that the construction record confirms was intentional, not accidental. Let's return to North America, where the documentation is often more granular. Philadelphia's water infrastructure, begun in the early 19th century, is taught in engineering history as a pioneering achievement. The Fairmount Waterworks, completed in stages from 1812 onward, used a turbine-driven pumping system to supply the city. What's less frequently noted is the capacity for which that system was engineered. Philadelphia's population at the time of the Fairmount system's major expansion was approximately 100,000. The engineered output of the system, documented in the original survey reports, was sufficient for a city of 400,000. A factor of 4. built into the original design, not added later, not expanded incrementally, present from the beginning. One response to this is that engineers routinely over-engineered municipal systems as a safety margin. That's reasonable. Except the margin here isn't 10 or 20%. It's 300%. And it appears consistently, not just in Philadelphia but in Cincinnati, in Pittsburgh, in New Orleans, in city after city where 19th century water infrastructure was surveyed and documented with similar results. The anomaly isn't one city overbuilding. The anomaly is a pattern that repeats at a scale and consistency that over-engineering as a cultural habit struggles to fully account for. There is a concept in economics called induced demand, the idea that supply creates its own use. Build a road and traffic fills it. Build a pipe and consumption rises to meet it. Historians sometimes apply this retroactively to explain the apparent mismatch between 19th century infrastructure capacity and the populations that initially used it. It's a legitimate framework. But induced demand works as an explanation when the gap between supply and use closes within a generation. When the water system built for 400,000 people serves 100,000 people, and that gap takes 60 years to close, the explanation becomes a different kind of argument. It doesn't explain the decision. It describes what eventually happened after the decision was already made. The question that remains is simpler than any framework. Who decided to build at that scale at that moment, and what did they know, or assume, that made it seem rational? Short answer: we don't always have records of the decision-making. That's not unusual. Administrative records from the 19th century are incomplete in predictable ways. Project costs were sometimes not preserved. Feasibility studies were sometimes lost. The reasoning behind specific engineering choices was often oral, passed between contractors and never formally documented. But the buildings remain. The tunnels remain. The water mains, now a century and a half old, remain, and in some cities are still in use. The physical record is more complete than the documentary one. And when you read the physical record, when you look at what was actually built, where, at what scale, and with what apparent assumptions baked into the design, the infrastructure of the 19th century raises questions that the standard narrative of demand drove supply doesn't fully resolve. Not because the narrative is wrong, but because the numbers don't quite fit. And when numbers don't fit in one city, you note it. When they don't fit in a dozen cities across 3 continents within the same 60-year window, you start to wonder what the pattern is actually describing. The pattern in North America and Russia is striking enough on its own. But it becomes harder to dismiss as regional coincidence when you extend the examination westward, across the Atlantic into Britain, and then back through the continental United States in the decades immediately following the Civil War. Because the pattern doesn't weaken as you move geographically. It intensifies. Start with London. By 1860, London was the largest city in the world, approximately 3.2 million people, dense, industrially active, economically dominant. When Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system was approved and constructed between 1858 and 1875, the scale of the project seemed, at least on the surface, proportionate to the city it served. Over 1,800 kilometers of street sewers. 318 kilometers of main intercepting sewers. A project of enormous ambition for an enormous city. Reasonable. Until you look at the design specifications. Bazalgette himself is quoted in engineering records as having doubled his initial pipe diameter calculations before finalizing the design. His stated reasoning: he didn't know how large London would become, so he built larger than necessary. That decision is celebrated in infrastructure history as visionary foresight. But the doubling wasn't a modest adjustment. The system as built handled, at capacity, a population significantly beyond Victorian London, a population London wouldn't reach until well into the 20th century. And Bazalgette's system, with relatively limited modification, is still partially operational today. A sewer system designed in 1858 that remains structurally functional in the 21st century. One interpretation: exceptional engineering. Another: the engineering assumed a continuity of use that the historical record doesn't fully explain. That whoever designed it expected the system to endure not for decades, but for generations. and built accordingly without apparent economic hesitation. Move north to Manchester and Birmingham. Both cities expanded rapidly during the Industrial Revolution. Both are studied as canonical examples of urbanization driven by factory demand. Population followed industry, infrastructure followed population. The sequence is textbook. Except the municipal buildings don't follow that sequence. Manchester's Town Hall, completed in 1877, is a Gothic revival structure of a scale and material quality that architectural historians have repeatedly noted as disproportionate to Manchester's municipal budget of that period. The building's construction cost, approximately £1 million in 1877, represented a significant fraction of the city's annual revenue. The stated justification was civic pride and commercial signaling. A grand building projected economic confidence to investors. That's a coherent explanation, but it assumes the primary function of the building was symbolic. When you examine the internal infrastructure, the pipe systems, the ventilation design, the load-bearing specifications of the floors, the building was engineered for operational intensity, not ceremonial use. The mechanical systems installed during construction were rated for continuous, heavy administrative function, not for occasional public gatherings. Birmingham's Council House, completed in 1879, presents a structurally similar case. Built at a cost difficult to reconcile with Birmingham's documented tax revenues of that period. Engineered internally with a specificity that exceeded any civic function the city was performing at the time. 2 cities. 2 buildings. Same decade. Same pattern. Construction investment and engineering precision that outpaced the documented economic and administrative demands of the institutions they housed. Now return to the United States, and look specifically at the post-Civil War infrastructure surge. Between 1865 and 1900, the United States undertook what historians describe as the most rapid infrastructure expansion in any nation's recorded history. Rail, bridges, municipal water, telegraph, all accelerating simultaneously. The standard explanation: post-war economic energy, westward expansion, and industrial capital seeking deployment. That explanation covers the volume of construction. It struggles to explain the specifications. The Eads Bridge in St. Louis, completed in 1874, was the first steel truss bridge in the United States. At the time of its completion, it was also the longest arch bridge in the world. Its designer, James Buchanan Eads, specified steel at a moment when American steel production was still maturing, before the Bessemer process had fully industrialized domestic output. The bridge's load rating at completion was significantly higher than any traffic the city of St. Louis could generate in 1874. It took decades for that bridge to be used at anything approaching its design capacity. Engineers called it over-engineering. Eads called it permanence. But permanence as a design philosophy raises its own question. Permanence for whom? If the economic demand doesn't exist yet, and the population doesn't exist yet, the decision to build permanent and large carries an assumption that something is coming, that the scale will eventually be needed. And in most cases, it eventually was. That detail, it eventually was, is where the standard narrative rests comfortably. Build large, demand catches up. Build permanent, time proves the investment. Hindsight validates the decision. But the timeline of that catch-up is rarely examined critically. When a bridge built for a city of 500,000 serves a city of 80,000 for 40 years before demand approaches capacity, the vindication of the original decision doesn't explain the original decision. It simply confirms that the builders weren't wrong. Not being wrong and having a documented rationale are 2 different things. Expand the frame further. To the American Midwest, specifically to the water tower construction boom of the 1870s and 1880s. Across cities in Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri, water towers were constructed during this period at a scale and aesthetic investment that historians of municipal architecture have quietly flagged as unusual. These are not purely functional structures. Many are built with decorative stonework, arched windows, and facade detailing that would require significant additional cost and labor, investment that serves no hydraulic function. The purely functional argument, we needed water pressure, we built towers, doesn't account for the ornamentation. The ornamentation implies a different kind of intention. Civic display, perhaps. Institutional signaling. The projection of permanence and authority through aesthetic investment. Or, as some architectural historians have framed it, these structures were built as if they were meant to be recognized, not merely used. That's a subtle distinction. But in aggregate, across dozens of cities, in the same narrow historical window, the consistency of that aesthetic decision becomes its own kind of data point. At some point, a pattern stops being a collection of individual choices and starts being evidence of a shared framework. Not a conspiracy. Not a hidden hand. A framework, a set of assumptions about scale, permanence, and purpose that appears to have been operating consistently across different cities, different engineers, different political administrations, different countries. What was that framework? Where did it come from? The orthodox answer points to the diffusion of engineering education. European-trained architects and civil engineers carrying shared methodologies into new territories. That's documented and real. But methodology explains how these structures were built. It doesn't fully explain why they were built to specifications that the immediate economic context didn't require. Some researchers, when examining these patterns collectively, have begun grouping them under a broader interpretive label, a way of naming the apparent consistency without claiming to fully explain it. That label and what it does and doesn't mean is where the examination leads next. Before that label is introduced, it's worth pausing on what the preceding patterns actually establish, and what they don't. What they establish is consistency. Across North America, across Britain, across Russia and Central Asia, within a concentrated historical window, infrastructure was built to specifications that exceeded documented immediate demand. The excess was not marginal. It was, in case after case, substantial. And the decision-making that produced that excess is, in many instances, either poorly documented or not documented at all. What the patterns do not establish is cause. They do not identify who made these decisions or why the specifications were set where they were, or what assumptions were operating beneath the surface of the engineering records we do have. That distinction matters. Because the moment you move from pattern to cause, you move from observation to interpretation. And interpretation, especially across this particular body of evidence, is where things become genuinely complicated. There are several interpretive frameworks that researchers and historians have applied to this body of evidence. The first is the most conventional, elite coordination. In the 19th century, infrastructure decisions were not made democratically. They were made by a relatively small class of engineers, financiers, and political administrators who moved between cities, shared professional networks, and carried consistent design philosophies across geographies. Under this framework, the consistency of overspecification isn't mysterious. It reflects a shared professional culture that valued permanence, redundancy, and scale as markers of institutional credibility. This explanation is well supported by the historical record. Engineering societies, architectural journals, and professional correspondence from this period document exactly the kind of cross-pollination that would produce consistent outcomes in different cities. The pattern is real, and this framework accounts for it without requiring anything beyond documented human coordination. The second framework is more speculative, though it draws on the same physical evidence. It proposes that the consistency of scale and specification reflects not just shared methodology, but inherited infrastructure. That some portion of what 19th century engineers documented as new construction was, in fact, adaptation or continuation of systems whose origins predate the construction records we have. This is a more uncomfortable argument, and it's important to be precise about what it does and doesn't claim. It doesn't claim that 19th century engineers were dishonest. It doesn't claim that official records were deliberately altered. It proposes, more narrowly, that the documentary record of 19th century infrastructure may be incomplete in ways that the physical record doesn't fully reflect. That some structures attributed to a particular decade may carry design elements, foundations, or material specifications that suggest a different or earlier origin. Architectural historians have noted, in isolated cases, exactly this kind of discrepancy. Buildings whose official construction dates sit in tension with material analyses or stylistic features. These cases are treated individually as anomalies or as evidence of earlier structures being repurposed. What the second framework proposes is that these anomalies are not isolated, that they form a pattern of their own. It is within this second, more speculative framework that a particular interpretive label has emerged in online research communities and increasingly in the margins of academic discussion. That label is Tartaria. It's necessary to be precise about what Tartaria means and what it doesn't, because the term carries significant variation in how it's used. In mainstream historical usage, Tartaria or Tartary refers to a geographic designation used in European maps from roughly the 13th through the 18th centuries. It described a vast, loosely defined territory spanning Central Asia, Siberia, and portions of Eastern Europe, regions that European cartographers understood imprecisely and labeled collectively. It was never a unified political entity in the way that empire or civilization implies. It was, in essence, a cartographic convenience, a label for territories that European knowledge systems hadn't yet fully categorized. That is the documented historical usage. In contemporary alternative research communities, the term has been repurposed, extended beyond its cartographic origins to serve as an interpretive label for the infrastructure patterns described in this examination. Under this usage, Tartaria doesn't refer to a mapped territory. It refers to a proposed explanatory framework, the idea that the consistency of 19th century overspecification reflects a prior organizational system whose physical output survived into the modern era, even as its documentary record did not. Some researchers use the term carefully as a hypothesis, a way of naming a pattern without claiming to explain it. Others use it as a conclusion, asserting a specific lost civilization with defined characteristics. These are meaningfully different uses of the same label, and collapsing them into one another obscures more than it clarifies. What the careful version of the Tartaria interpretive framework actually asks is a limited but genuinely interesting question. Is it possible that the infrastructure consistency documented across the 19th century reflects organizational continuity from a prior period, and that what we interpret as forward-looking over-engineering was, in some cases, the continuation or rehabilitation of systems already in place? That question cannot be answered by the physical evidence alone. It would require documentary corroboration, administrative records, construction accounts, material analyses, that either doesn't exist or hasn't been systematically assembled. What can be said is that the question is not, on its face, unreasonable. Archaeology routinely documents cases where later civilizations built on, adapted, or incorporated the infrastructure of earlier ones. Roman aqueducts repurposed by medieval towns. Byzantine foundations beneath Ottoman structures. The reuse of prior infrastructure is not a fringe concept. It's a documented pattern across human history. The Tartaria framework, in its most restrained form, applies that documented pattern to the 19th century and asks whether it might be operative there as well. Some researchers find that question productive. Others find the existing explanations, elite coordination, professional diffusion, economic optimism, sufficient to account for the evidence without requiring an additional layer of interpretation. Neither position has been definitively resolved by the available record. What the physical evidence does do, regardless of which interpretive framework one applies, is resist simple closure. The water systems remain. The tunnels remain. The bridges and town halls and railway stations built for populations that didn't yet exist remain. Many of them still functional, still in use, outlasting the economic assumptions that were supposed to have produced them. And the documentary record, where it exists, raises questions about specification and decision-making that the standard narrative of demand-driven development doesn't fully resolve. That gap between what was built and what the immediate context required is real. It is present in the engineering records. It is present in the architectural surveys. It is present in the municipal budgets and population data of the period. What that gap means is not settled.